From Paris to Caracas and Hong Kong to Santiago, mass protests have been unraveling all over the world. While it may seem that they have different reasons that spark them, there is a common theme linking these demonstrations. Each one of these large-scale protests have their own distinct local factors, but when you look at them as social movements drawing on each other, they tell a much broader story of what can happen when a society becomes fed up with corruption, inequality, and lack of political freedoms. Let's take a look at the 2019 uprisings in France, Lebanon, and Chile. At surface level, they all share a key economic breaking point. The French government tried to raise fuel prices. Chile attempted to raise the metro fare, and Lebanon sought to tax WhatsApp calls. Outrage gripped these countries that have all faced years of unequal costs of living as well as a slipping standard of living. With the coming of age of a younger generation, dissatisfaction with the status quo and a desperation for affordable housing and a decent income is leading the way. So while the rise of a key service may have been the final straw, a much bigger issue has kept these movements going. Many of the governments have even walked back the changes, such as in Chile and France. However, the poor and working class have had enough. Other similarities? The government's reactions. They have reacted in many cases, fighting fire with fire by police and military intervention. However, even the threat of arrest and violence by authorities hasn't been enough to discourage these mass demonstrations, as we have seen in Hong Kong, even on key dates such as the 70th anniversary of the People's Republic of China. Governments in many cases have tried to concede, as we have seen in Chile, but for too many, it was too little too late. The case of Chile is a complicated one. As one of Latin America's wealthiest and most developed economies, it also faces one of the highest income inequality rates in the world, with 7.2% of its 17.8 million residents facing unemployment. Chile has traditionally been regarded as one of the most prosperous and politically stable countries of South America. But in 2019, a hike in metro fare set off a movement against inequality. How did they get there? And what does this mean for the international community? First, it's important to talk about the events that led to this breaking point.
Esta nunca ha sido dictadura, señores. Esta es dicta blanda.
The end of the Augusto Pinochet dictatorship in 1990 wasn't a clean break. The military retained power, and the 1988 constitution created under Pinochet regime remains to this day. Consequently, all future governments preserved economic policies, part of the extreme laissez-faire economic system imposed in the 70s and 80s. And while this development model generated growth and statistically reduced poverty, it was at the cost of the middle class. Chile came to be known as Latin America's great economic success story, one of the most developed countries in the region, a seemingly peaceful and ordered society where life was easy and people were happy. But the reality couldn't be farther from the truth. Poverty levels below 15% and the highest GDP per capita in the region do not make up for the fact that, according to the World Bank, Chile has a Gini index of 46.6 in 2017. The United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean found that in 2017, half of the lowest income households in the country had access to only 2.1% of the country's net wealth, while the wealthiest 1% kept 26.5% of the wealth, making Chile the most unequal country within the OECD. Furthermore, according to data from the Institution of National Statistics of Chile, the average monthly wage in 2018 was 400,000 Chilean pesos, about $550. That means about 80% of the households cannot cover their expenses with their current salaries. And for 20% of the poorest in Chile, transport takes 30% of their salary. This is why in October 2019, students in the capital organized evasiones masivas after the government announced a fare hike of 30 pesos, or about 0.039 of a US dollar. On October 17th, the protests escalated to a collective fare evasion known as #Evasión todo el día. Authorities weren't allowed to enter metro stations, and the protests quickly spilled out into the streets, leading to the burning of stations, supermarkets, and many other buildings. Anti-government demonstrations carried on in Santiago and spread to other cities like Viña del Mar and Valparaíso. And by October 19th, President Piñera reversed the fare hike and called for a dialogue. But the demonstrations continued, and so did the military repression. What began as peaceful demonstrations turned into a united response against governmental military force. that led to the arrest of thousands and many reported disappearances, bringing back memories and tactics that have not been seen since the Pinochet regime. Authorized repressive tactics included the use of tear gas, water cannons, and military tanks, descending onto the streets and shooting rubber bullets. Piñera set a military curfew and declared a 15-day state of emergency, but the stakes were already too high, and demands for better health services, higher wages, livable pensions, more accessible education all greatly outweighed the government's response. Ultimately, people were demanding Piñera's resignation and a reform to what many considered an outdated constitution. Seeing that the military strategy was not working, on October 22nd, Piñera apologized to the nation and announced a package of social measures. Finally, on October 28th, Piñera announces the resignation of one-third of his cabinet. However, protests continue and the president decides to pull Chile from being the host of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit, as well as the United Nations Climate Change Conference. It has not been months since the initial clashes. Civil unrest has eased up, but the pressure of the protests resulted in President Piñera opening up to the possibility of reforming the Constitution. A referendum is going to be held in April of this year, and the population will decide if they would like to change the Constitution and which governmental agency should be in charge of writing it. The latest official data states that there have been over 6,000 people arrested, 2,000 people hurt, and at least 20 dead. This nature of this conflict has attracted the attention of human rights organizations like the UN High Commission on Human Rights and Amnesty International. Both are currently in the country investigating allegations of human rights abuses against demonstrators by the Carabineros police and other authorities. On November 16th, the president recognized and condemned these abuses committed by the police against protesters, and he promised justice. In the South America region, solidarity over the protests grew exponentially as people gathered to protest in front of Chilean embassies. Similar movements against governments have sparked in several countries, such as Bolivia and Colombia. Geopolitically speaking, adding up these three to the ongoing conflict in Venezuela and Ecuador, some analysts believe we are in the middle of the South American Spring. However, others argue that this may all be part of a worldwide movement. Chile's uprising represents just one example of the many that are simultaneously going on in the world. The Chilean population is tired of years of an economic model that perpetuates inequality based on a dictatorial constitution. The civil unrest are the manifestation of the frustration being felt around the world. In Chile, change may be around the corner.